Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest workshop in our New Mexico Recover series. We have a special guest today. We'll get to Nancy Hood in just a moment, but I'm Robert Nelson. I use he, him pronouns. We're just letting everybody in. Thanks for everybody for your patience. And we do have a lot of folks registered for this workshop in particular. A lot of questions about evaluation, especially with federal grants and for the recovery especially. So a little bit about Pivotal New Mexico. If you've never done this before, Pivotal was started in 2016 to help nonprofit organizations or other public institutions compete for and obtain funding from, especially from out of state, either from philanthropy or federal government. We have a bevy of programs from our Talent Academy, which is a 4-month deep dive into grant writing and grant seeking. We've served over yes, we can do that. We've served over 50 different organizations and raised about $12.7 million with those organizations. And that includes nonprofits and governments and other public institutions like hospitals and school districts and stuff like that. So we're doing a lot of work around the state. And our other programs are our cooperative network, which actually brings this little program to you today. We offer a whole lot of different webinars, trainings, one-off kind of trainings or anything like that, where people can engage and get to know each other and get to know what's going on around the state and also build their capacity for grant seeking and grant writing. And then we do a bevy of other projects too, like Grow New Mexico, which is our outreach into rural New Mexico. We have a whole lot of different other projects, whether it's in southern New Mexico, northeastern New Mexico, or the northwest corner, or even the southwest corner. But we've started to expand across the state a lot of the time. So I will say that our next New Mexico Recovers workshop is actually next Wednesday, on Wednesday the 16th at 2 p.m. at the very same link. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be with our good friend Tanya Brown, who's in the audience today. As an audience member, not as our trainer today, but she'll be back next week to talk about top 10 grant seeking tips. So if you're interested in more grant seeking knowledge, stop by on the 16th, next Wednesday at 2 p.m. over Zoom. We'll gladly we'll send out the registration link here very soon too. So I think that's about it. And with that, I will gladly pass to our wonderful host, Nancy Hood, who I've known since her work at Apex Evaluation, but now is over at Project Echo. Thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us today. I'm going to spotlight you, and you're welcome to take it away.
Thanks, Robert. And it's really a privilege to be here with you all, although I don't necessarily enjoy being reminded that I'm going to be spotlighted for all of you. It's okay. We'll have slides soon and you won't have to look at me. But I'm going to share a little bit about myself and then frame the presentation, and then we'll get going. And we'll have a few interactive things, so please keep your browsers handy and be careful if you step away for coffee. But I understand if you need to step away for coffee. So I'm Nancy Hood. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I come with another hat in addition to my day job doing research and evaluation at Project Echo at UNM. I'm also on the board of New Mexico Evaluators. And we're a statewide nonprofit membership association for people who do and use evaluation. And so I'm kind of coming from both of those roles today. My background is public health. I've been doing program evaluation for about 20 years in a lot of different community-based settings. I've worked at the city health department and affordable housing and social services and workforce development, and then a lot of healthcare and behavioral health. So I know just enough about a lot of things to be really dangerous. I will say my hardest job ever was a few years that I led a supportive services team for a nonprofit property management company that did supportive services for the subsidized housing residents. And so for 3 years, I had the privilege of leading that team and working really directly with a lot of the residents and staff. And that was the hardest work I've ever done. And it was very hard, as it turns out, to do evaluation. And when you're in the role of providing direct services and leading that team. And I was somebody that was trained in evaluation and believed in it. And I experienced firsthand how difficult it is. So I share that not to be discouraging, but to hopefully communicate empathy and understanding for many of you that are working in very, very, very hectic frontline, nonprofit and government settings. So just a couple other things about me. I come with biases, as most people do. I am fortunate to have a number of identities that have privilege that come with them. And I've truly spent my life and will spend the rest of my life trying to learn and practice how to be an ally and use my privilege for allyship. And of course, I can't be the judge of that, only others can be. And it is completely a lifelong journey. And that's true for evaluation as well as any other work that I do. Another bias is I believe evaluation can be useful. So I'm not willing to settle for a check the box sort of evaluation. So if you came for that, you might want to sign off now. I'm going to try to convince you otherwise today. So that's just a little bit about me. And I would love if people could pop in the chat, maybe the organization you're with, just your role, and maybe what sector you're in if it's not obvious from your organization, just so I can have a tiny sense of who's in the audience today. I'll give you a second to get to the chat box there. The Nuclear Museum. Oh, I have so many questions, Olivia, already, but I'll hold my tongue. All right, we've got a lot of different sectors, a lot of public sectors, education, behavioral health. We have some evaluators. Please jump in and plus one or correct as needed. Really have a whole wide range of folks, a lot from government. Great, this is super helpful. Thank you for sharing. I'm gonna start with well, actually, I'll start by telling you what we're gonna do today. So Robert asked me to do Evaluation 101, and I'm gonna share my slides. All right, are you seeing my slides, Robert? So demystifying evaluation is how I chose to frame this, because I really believe we are all evaluators. So we ask ourselves and answer so many evaluation questions in everyday life. You know, everything from how good was that new recipe that I just tried to, you know, did that meeting, that thing I tried in the meeting with my team, did that go well? What went well? What didn't? So I really do think the real question is what isn't an evaluation? And in fact, who isn't an evaluator? And I think for some reason, evaluation has this mystique around it, that it's this, you know, maybe magical thing that you can only do if you're highly trained. And I'm going to try to convince you as otherwise, and maybe just help you have some practical tools and have it be a little less scary of a thing. So we're not going to talk a lot specifically about federal grant requirements, but the gist today is that, you know, all grants they're going to have really specific things that they want you to say you're going to do around evaluation, or how they want you to describe it. And I believe that if you set your evaluation priorities for yourself and your program and your organization, you can then fit those in, you can retrofit those in most times to what the grant is asking for, rather than vice versa. So rather than saying, I'm going to do this because the grant asked for it, you're going to say, this is our evaluation approach, and then figure out how to put it into the grant context. So we're not going to talk specific about what grants ask for, but that's kind of the gist or the philosophy underlying my approach today with you. So let's do a quick poll to start out with. And so to go to this poll, you're going to type in pollev.com/Project Echo D101. Let me put that in the chat. It's easier to. So if you click on that, and The poll should be activated. So the question on the poll is, what word comes to mind when you hear the word evaluation? We've already got our first entries. What word comes to mind when you hear the word evaluation? Data, report, complicated, thank you for being honest, critique, retrospective, measure, ugh, status, judgment, information, data is getting more votes, impact, progress. Great, so I see a combination of questions that are talking about kind of the way we do evaluation. So data, track, usually somebody said measurement, and then there's some words that are about some scary things about evaluation. Complicated seems to be gaining some traction. There's some other scary things. Ugh, judgment can be scary, critique can be scary. And then there's some things about what we can get from evaluation that I'm seeing you sharing. So progress and impact, learning, I think I saw. So all of those things are real. We have certain things that we need to do evaluation, and then there's some scary or unknown parts, and then there's some benefits that we can get from it. And you all are thinking about all of those things. We're going to cover all of those things today. So thank you for sharing, giving us a little glimpse into your brain to find out what evaluation means to you. So today we're going to do kind of a sandwich approach. We're going to set the stage. Then we're going to look through tools for planning evaluations, collecting data, and using data. And then we're going to, the bottom bun of the sandwiches, we're going to talk about some evaluation resources. And I handpicked some that I think are particularly practical that you might find useful. So for setting the stage, the first thing to think through is really why to evaluate. And my favorite reason for evaluating is program improvement and sort of continuous learning. A lot of times people jump immediately to looking at outcomes and impact, sometimes with rigorous designs. And that's an important aspect of evaluation too. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but we're not going to get into details about different designs. And then another reason to evaluate is, of course, to get funding and sustainability. I would encourage you, though, not to limit your approach to evaluation as only selling your program. So the first question for a program improvement is really about using evaluation for learning. And so growing sunflowers from seed can actually be an interesting way to illustrate the use of evaluation for continuous improvement or learning. About a year ago, I got motivated to grow some sunflowers from seed and also some tomatoes. And you can see the first picture there on the left shows just dirt. So there's seeds in there, but they're not coming up yet. And then the middle picture shows the little seedlings starting to pop up. And then finally they get a little bigger. And so particularly that stage where the little seedlings are starting to pop up, I was monitoring and collecting data about those little seeds and seedlings kind of on an hourly basis. So I would, get up after a meeting and pop upstairs because that's where it was sunniest. And I'd look at them and I'd say, that one looks a little dry. I'm going to give it a little bit of water here. Or I think I need to turn the tray because they're starting to lean towards the window. And I was continually collecting data on these seedlings. And you can imagine if I went even maybe 2 or 3 days without collecting data at this point, especially when my seeds are just starting, they wouldn't have thrived. And that's true sometimes with programs too, especially if a program's new. If you're not collecting data, kind of reflecting on it, even informally, regularly, it might not thrive. It needs a little bit more tender care at that point in the process. And then after a while, they got big, and the seedlings got big enough they could be transferred outside. I was able to set up irrigation, so there was kind of some systemization of the way the program or the seedlings were running. And then, of course, when they become big flowers, I didn't have to monitor them nearly as frequently. I still did. I still needed to collect data because sometimes their leaves were droopy and it turns out the irrigation was plugged and things like that. So, this kind of illustrates that immediate feedback of using data for making a change, even if you don't know what it's going to be in advance, to be constantly reflecting on what you're doing. And that's really a benefit of evaluation that sometimes I think is overlooked or not recognized. So the gist here is, what do you want to know about your program so that you can do the best work possible? And today we're really going to talk about kind of two different types of evaluation. How are you doing the work, which is sometimes called process evaluation, and then what outcomes are you achieving? And that's often called outcome evaluation. But the focus here is on what you need, not necessarily on what the funder needs. And so if you figure that out, then you can translate it to what the funder is asking you for in many cases. So just a couple other things in setting the stage. I want to acknowledge that, there is a lot of lingo in evaluation. It's kind of like alphabet soup, and you can kind of get a helpless feeling sometimes when you're trying to read through the lingo. So I wanted to give you a little secret and say that even evaluators and people that use evaluation all the time often don't use the same terms for things. So that works to your benefit because it's always okay to ask what a term means. So if you're looking at a grant proposal or RFP, and it says, that you need to describe what your outcomes are going to be, they should really give you a little bit more information about what they mean about outcomes at that point. And if they don't, it's absolutely okay to ask, because people use that term for a lot of different things. And if you're working with an evaluator and they use a term like indicators, it's absolutely okay to ask what they mean, because people mean very different things by these terms. So, just as an example, if you're trying to describe what a program ultimately seeks to achieve, some people call that a goal, some people call that impact. There's probably 5 other words for it too. If you're talking about counting what a program did and who it reached, some people call those outputs, some people call them performance measures. If you're talking about a piece of data related to a specific concept, some people call those indicators, some people call those measures. So it's always okay to ask. In this presentation, I'm using the word program really generally to mean any set of activities to achieve a goal. So that's one word that I wanted to, or one word that I wanted to define to help us communicate better today. I know some of you might be working less on specific programs and more on maybe what an organization is doing, or doing more work in the community. So just if you could, when I use the word program, other than thinking that doesn't apply to you, just think of it as the set of activities that you're doing or planning to reach some sort of goal. And again, with terminology, ask early and often. It is not, there's no such thing as a stupid question when people are talking about evaluation. And then the last thing I wanted to say in setting the stage for today is evaluation is not a neutral activity. And so this could be a month-long session in and of itself about how to do evaluation in a way that's culturally responsive. It promotes equity. It addresses social injustices. And so, just very basically, I wanted to call attention to this and point out that basically in every step of the evaluation process, there's a need and a benefit from considering culture, race, ethnicity, power, trauma, voice, and the stakeholders you're engaging, your program design, your evaluation questions, how you design your measures, how you collect your data, who collects the data, and then certainly how you report it, the story you tell with the data and the results. And then there's a lot of considerations around evaluation consultants and just more broadly, who's doing the evaluation. So now we're going to get into the meat of the presentation today, and we're going to talk about tools for planning evaluations first. So this cartoon says, love the report, but could you email me the numbers I actually care about? And I am embarrassed, but not unwilling to share that I've experienced this before, and it's very painful. And so one of the things we're going to talk about with planning is engaging stakeholders so that you know what they actually care about before you start doing your work. So one of the steps in planning and evaluation is identifying and engaging those key stakeholders. And you can kind of think about stakeholders in terms of what's their interest level in the program or the evaluation, and then what's their influence. And certainly people who have a high level of interest and a high level of influence, you want to engage them most thoroughly and thoughtfully in the evaluation. And then the others, if they have a lot of influence, but maybe not a lot of interest, you want to try to find ways, maybe indirect ways to anticipate what they're going to want and need from the evaluation and take steps to address those. Somebody that's a high level of interest, but not maybe so much influence, you want to keep them informed. So those are your three main groups. So think through, for influence, I think it's important to note that I thought of three different types of influence. So certainly cultural or community influence, the people that are most closely connected to those that you're trying to reach or serve. That's an incredibly important type of influence. So you want to identify who from the community you're serving should be engaged as a stakeholder in the evaluation process, for example. And maybe it's somebody on your team, maybe it's your evaluator, or maybe it's a partner. But having that voice at the table when you're thinking through your evaluation is really important. There's also obviously financial influence. That's probably the one that we think of most often, and then political influence. So think for a second, who are your key stakeholders for evaluation activities that you do? And where do they fall on this stakeholder map? And maybe if a few folks would be willing to type in who are some of your key stakeholders for figuring out your evaluation plan and priorities for your work. Funders are definitely a key stakeholder. Clients are another really important stakeholder that a lot of people forget about. And I think that's where coming back to, and the people that are participating in the services, board of directors, the community we serve, donors, absolutely, internal leadership. City council, the public, legislators. So you've got a good start on who your stakeholders are and that might be interested in being involved in planning your evaluation. So one of the next steps in most evaluations after thinking through your stakeholders is to really describe thoroughly what you're doing with your program. Again, this can be any set of activities that you're doing. And a logic model can be a really good tool for fully describing your program. And a logic model simply lays out kind of the logic, if you will, of what inputs you have in your program, what activities you're doing, and then what they're going to lead to. So outputs are things that you can count to describe the activities and the participants, and then shorter term outcomes and longer term outcomes. The short term outcomes often include things like increased awareness, improved knowledge and skills, improved attitudes and behavior changes. And then longer term impacts are often things like changes in well-being or actual changes that you see in communities or systems or policies. And I think one of the key things to realize about a logic model is the most benefit can come from it if you're actually engaging those stakeholders that you just thought through in giving input or at least reviewing the logic model. And if you're thinking about it reflectively to say, okay, well, we're doing this activity and we say this is our short-term outcome, but if we really think about it, this activity we're doing is maybe not enough or maybe not the right target to change this outcome. So the logic part of the logic model is really, really important. And so creating space to reflect on your logic model and not just sort of finish it and toss it in the proposal is the opportunity here. And if you do a logic model, it also has the benefit of helping you clarify what your program design is at the same time that you're laying your foundation for doing the evaluation. And so if we go back to, I said there were kind of those two main types of evaluation we were going to talk about. The first part of the logic model is your process. How are you doing what you're doing? And the second part is your outcome evaluation. And a logic model, oh, actually, I forgot about this. There's a couple other pieces that are often included in the logic model. So often you'll state at the top the overall goal or purpose. And then it can also be really helpful to give a little bit of, give a box about the context of the program, and then also some assumptions that you're making about how the program's going to work or what things could possibly prevent the program from being successful. And another thing that I think is really helpful is that a logic model doesn't have to be that linear necessarily. So this is a really awesome example from Rebecca Ray, who did a great presentation at a New Mexico Evaluators conference a couple of years ago called Rethinking Logic Models. And she used the example of a corn plant, which is important to many Native communities, as an illustration of the kinds of things that we're trying to illustrate in a logic model. But it's more logical in a cultural context to think about something like the growth of a corn plant and the thriving of a plant, rather than necessarily boxes and arrows. So you can see here in this example, the logic kind of builds from the bottom. So the roots are the goal. That's the foundation of the program design. And then as it grows up, it talks about objectives and activities and outputs. And then the very, very top is, how will we know things have changed? What will we see from that? What kind of outcomes? So I think it can be, your logic model could actually be a picture like this. Another example is, this was just a random one that I found online, but this is a logic model for obviously multifaceted program focused on climate change. And so you can see they integrated a lot of aspects of climate change, things that are important to climate change, in the logic model itself, and then had some color coding here to think about professional outcomes and public outcomes. And so these are just two. If you Google logic model images, you'll see a lot of different examples to maybe give you some inspiration of what might be more relevant to the program team and also the communities that you're working with. So the next step in planning your evaluation, you've engaged your stakeholders, you've done your logic model to describe your program. Often the next step is actually laying out what questions you want to answer. So these are some common kinds of questions around process evaluation. What activities did you do? How many people participated? I think there's often some really good questions about your focus population. Did you reach your intended focus population? What were reasons why people participated more or less? There's also some equity process questions. Who wasn't able to participate in the program? How culturally appropriate were the program activities or the staff? You can ask questions about participant feedback. How satisfied were they? What did they find most useful? Just kind of at face value. You can ask questions about quality. To what extent did the program use best practices? Did they adapt best practices, and what were the reasons for that? And then financial questions are often really important. Whoops, I stole this from one of my ECHO trainings and forgot to change it, but You can ask questions about how much did your program cost and how does that compare to the cost of similar programs. And then when it's appropriate, you can ask outcome evaluation questions too. If your program is established and ready to move on to those shorter term and longer term outcomes. So you can ask just a basic monitoring question around outcomes of what evidence was there that participants had positive outcomes, or that communities or systems had positive outcomes. And then kind of the next level up on outcome questions is a pre-post question. Did outcomes improve before and after the program? And then the next level up might be a comparison group. And this is not usually something that's feasible in just a typical program, but every once in a while it's possible. And you can ask whether your outcomes were better compared to a different group that didn't do the program. Again, you can ask equity questions here. You can ask if everybody had the same outcomes, or maybe some participants had better outcomes than others. And you can ask things about like levels of participation. So were higher levels of participation associated with better outcomes? So those were some tools for planning your evaluation. We talked about the stakeholder mapping, the logic model, and the evaluation questions. So next we're going to talk about tools for collecting data. And there's a little cartoon here that I kind of liked about Santa filling out a satisfaction survey. And so the kiddo is feeling better prepared to know what kind of cookies to leave next year. So when we think about collecting data, we have to get a little bit more specific than those questions and actually think about our measures. And there's a really good resource that I included at the end here from a tool called results-based accountability. The only bad thing about this resource is the name. I don't like the name results-based accountability. It's not nearly as unfriendly as that sounds. In fact, it's very friendly. And they advocate for thinking of only 3 types of measures. How much did you do? How well did you do it? And is anybody better off? And if you aren't currently doing evaluation, or if you're just starting your program, you could simply pick one measure in each of these areas. Maybe you don't even get to the better off question when you're first starting a program. So again, the point is to start with a few meaningful measures and do those consistently, and then go from there. So how much do you do is quite often just being able to report your number of participants, your number of activities or services, or whatever it is that you're doing. How well did you do it? You're often asking about satisfaction, or maybe attendance rates. How many people came back? How many people completed the program, perhaps? You could ask, how well did you reach the focused population? Did the people that came to your program or your activity, were they the ones you intended to reach, or was it somebody else? You could also ask about things like the qualifications of the staff. You could ask about things like the lived experience of the staff and how well does it match the population that's being served. Those are the kinds of things that are in the how well category. And then better off, a really common measure is how many participants improved in some skill, some attitude, some behavior, or some circumstance. And this can absolutely be done in stories. It doesn't have to necessarily be numbers. And you can also have stories about things like the types of changes that you saw to communities, policies, systems, environments in the better off category. So it's absolutely fine to sort of not feel like you need to be technical when you think through what the answers to these questions are for your work. How much did you do? How well did you do it? And is anyone better off? And then you have to figure out how to collect the data. So these, I would say, are kind of the 5 most common data collection methods or approaches that are used in community-based evaluation. Program records are usually those things that you use to document what happened in the program or the participants. And there's some ideas of tools that you might use to do that. The key thing in program records is to just be simple and consistent and know who's gonna write down what. It doesn't have to be fancy. Surveys are also really common. This is usually you can collect data from participants or clients. Usually that's who we think of doing surveys with, but you can also collect data from staff or partners or stakeholders. Usually surveys are mostly closed-ended questions. So you ask a question and give people response choices. And I would strongly recommend don't ever do a survey that's more than 10 questions. That's not, you're not going to find that in a textbook anywhere, but definitely, I like to say I'd rather have a survey with 3 questions that I get 80% of the people to respond to, rather than a survey with 30 questions that I get 10% of the people to respond to. So resist the urge to do long surveys. And incidentally, if you do your planning steps earlier on, you have a better idea of what you want to focus on. So then when you get to creating a survey, there's less chance that you're going to say, "Ooh, that would be interesting to ask. That would be interesting to ask," because you've already decided in those previous steps we talked through what you're going to focus on. So another common data collection method is focus groups or interviews. And I think it's very fair to also talk about these methods in terms of storytelling. The idea here is that you use some kind of facilitated process to get richer and more in-depth data from a smaller number of people. Usually these kind of approaches are more open-ended questions. Another set of data collection approaches I'm calling participatory here. And this might be something that many of you are interested in if you haven't thought about this before. So these are really ways to, it kind of builds on a focus group or a facilitated group process usually, but it's using more creative and engaging ways to get information from participants or staff or partners about their experiences with your work. So there's a method, for example, called photo voice, where it's a structured process for having participants take photographs of their environment or their lives or maybe their workplaces at different points in time. And then that process also involves facilitating dialogue among participants about why they took the photos that they did and what it means to them and what might have changed over time and why. You can also do something like collages. So I was involved in some focus groups with some youth and young adults one time where they were in behavioral health services and we were just kind of coming in, cold as the evaluators. We didn't have relationships with the youth. And we were pretty skeptical that they would be willing to really open up to us. So instead of doing a traditional focus group, we brought a bunch of magazines and glue and markers and things like that. And my co-facilitator had music that youth would like, which I didn't know what that was, but fortunately she knew what that was. And so we played music and had some prompting questions to ask people to create different collages about their, something that speaks to what they were thinking when they started the program, and then something that speaks to what their experience was in the program, and then another picture of where they're at now. And the result, these one-page collages just spoke volumes more. And then we had them talk about why they chose the things that they did too. And it just got much more in-depth and rich information than a traditional focus group approach would. Another benefit of these participatory approaches is that a lot of times your program staff are already very, very skilled at group facilitation processes or being creative. And this might be something that can even be done as part of your program activities. Not, it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate data collection activity that an evaluator does, for example. So I'm really excited about participatory methods and would be happy to talk more about these if anyone's interested. And then a final common method for data collection is I'm calling administrative data. Sometimes it's called secondary data, but this is data that exists somewhere that somebody already collected. You didn't have to collect it, but it might be useful for you. So this would include things like student assessment data, census data, or American Community Survey data is sometimes helpful for evaluations. If you're working in higher education, they would definitely have a lot of data that might be helpful. So thinking about if you can use data either from your own institution or a partner institution that they already have that could be somehow useful so that you don't have to collect it again. So then the plan kind of puts these things together. So you've got your measures. Remember, we talked about the how much, how well, and is anybody better off? So, this table here could be your evaluation plan. You've got your measure, you've got your method, and then you've got the tools that you're going to use. I just made these up. If you have access to Excel, Excel is a great way to track attendance or something like that. If you don't have access to Excel, Google Sheets, or even Word are other options. And then laying out the frequency of when you're going to do it and the person responsible. And you can see here, I put in an evaluator. I know everybody doesn't have the luxury of having an evaluator on your team or somebody as a consultant, but the evaluator really, if you work with an evaluator, they aren't even the main people usually that are important for data collection. A lot of times it is necessary it's helpful if not necessary for the program teams to really integrate the data collection into how they do their work. I'll give you one other example of that. In a program I evaluated at the Affordable Housing Organization that I mentioned earlier, we had this self-sufficiency matrix that we were doing kind of case management coaching type engagement with families to try to move them forward in different aspects of self-sufficiency. And so there was this grid that sort of had, I think, 5 levels and multiple areas of self-sufficiency that we wanted to monitor how people were moving throughout those categories while they were in services. And they were usually in services for like a year or two. And so the coach actually used that tool as a way to support their coaching conversations with participants. And then it doubled as a data collection tool. So we didn't, for example, have to have a whole separate form or meeting with a participant to get those data. It was integrated into the coaching process. So in data collection, tips for data collection are to do the planning first. Remember, I said if you don't plan first, you have a lot of there's a lot of risk of just kind of blowing out your surveys or your focus groups to say all the things you think are interesting because you haven't focused yet. Pick a few simple measures and stick with them. And again, tell your funders what you're measuring. Don't measure it because your funders tell you to when you can. Collect stories whenever you can, and then integrate data collection with program activities, like I was just saying. In terms of my favorite is, let's do a survey. If you find yourself falling in that trap, and I have actually fallen into that trap myself, or been involved with others who have, you get a 50-question survey before the end of an hour if you haven't already done your planning. Don't try to collect too much. Evaluation, if you're not going to use the data, don't collect it. So start with a little bit and really focus on it, and then you can add to it rather than taking away. Don't forget about the power of stories. Very, very, very powerful. And again, relatively easy to integrate into the program itself. And don't rely on the evaluator for too much. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about working with evaluation consultants. And then don't let the funding dramatically change your program or your data whenever possible. And I know that's very difficult because funding is limited, but try to stick with your plan and what's actually useful for you. So the last section of the meat of the sandwich is tools for using data. I didn't say tools for reporting because I wanted to emphasize using data instead of making reports. And so this cartoon is also a little too close to home for comfort, but I think a really good reminder. We spent the last 3 months writing the evaluation report. Unfortunately, we drained the budget and we're unable to share it with anyone. And so we don't want you to do that, whether it's your own staff that you've drained their capacity or a consultant that you're working with. So here's a really simple idea for a data use plan. Think about who your audience is. So one key audience is program staff. And one important thing for them to do is look at the data regularly, maybe monthly, possibly even more frequently, and make sure it's complete, accurate, up to date. And this is in contrast to sort of waiting till the annual report at the end of the year and then having people review the data and finding out that you might have some problems or some missing data. Another key audience is the funder. And so a lot of times this is, of course, as you know extremely well, going to be a required report format. Usually it's annual, but of course it might be more frequent. And, you know, I think if they require a specific format that's not helpful for you to actually learn from the data, I would say just try to spend as few resources as possible to get that done and focus on these other things. Again, I'm involved in programs where we fall into this trap all the time. We've got these massive required reports for the funders, but it's not really the way it's helpful for us to work on the data. But we're so tired once we get the report done that we forget to actually look at the data and use it. So try not to have the requirements suck all of your interest in using the data out of you. And I know that's hard. For leadership, leadership often just wants a really super quick summary or dashboard. Maybe that's quarterly or twice a year. Often that's an evaluator that can help you with that, but it certainly doesn't have to be. In fact, the program managers or leadership of the program are often in a better position to know what the organization leadership actually wants or needs. And then kind of creating opportunities to actually reflect on the data. That can involve partners, program staff, other stakeholders, even leadership. And there's increasingly in the evaluation world, there's this idea of having data parties where, you know, you've got like snippets of the data up in terms of posters or placemats or ways for people to kind of interact with the data, even if it's low tech, and really get people talking about the data. So looking at some of the findings and asking your key stakeholders, what do you see here that you expected to see? And what's something that you see that surprises you? And what's something that kind of tells you we got to keep doing something specific that we're doing, or something that suggests we might want to try something different. So the idea of actually having a space and a time for people to reflect on the data and learn from it, and decide what it means for them is increasingly common. And it's something that you can absolutely include proactively in your reporting or evaluation plan to help your funder know that you actually care about learning from the data. These are just a few examples from my current work where we're really trying to use more dashboards close to real time, although that can be challenging to share the data rather than, say, a 50-page annual report. But of course, there's a time and a place for everything, and a lot of times you have to meet requirements and then find other ways to actually make the data useful. So the last section, the bottom bun of the sandwich, is just going through a few evaluation resources, including consultants. So I kind of like this evaluation slide. We have no idea what you're talking about. Trust me, it's science. This is not what you want from your evaluation consultant. There should never be a trust me, it's evaluation, or this is the opposite of what you want. So I just thought I'd share a few thoughts about working with evaluation consultants. And I've been on both sides of this. I've been the consultant and the one managing a consultant at various times in my career. And New Mexico Evaluators actually has a member directory online. We have almost 90 members right now. And if they choose to share their information publicly, they are on our public website at this link at the member directory. And so this might be a good resource if you're looking for a potential evaluation consultant to peruse through that. And I'm pretty sure their contact information is on there. And I'd love to get your feedback on that directory if it's helpful or if something would be more helpful. But even when you're working with an evaluation consultant, I want to encourage you to take the stance that you're the expert in your work. They might have some tools and tricks and ideas, but you are still the expert. And so I think there's a tendency to, again, put evaluation in this category of being a really specialized expertise, and there's just another resource for you. They're a support for your work, and it should feel that way in your relationship with them. The role of an evaluation consultant can vary a lot. They could provide technical assistance. So if you have some capacity on your team, but you're not quite sure if you're going in the right direction, you can get somebody to help sort of review what you're doing and give you some tips, but not actually do the work themselves, which is often a more economic way to do it. Or they can do everything related to the evaluation. But even if they do everything, you should still expect that they're highly collaborative, they're respectful, they have an understanding of the community being served. Ideally, maybe they or a team member is from the community being served, that they're proposing efforts that are feasible, useful, and of course, they're following ethical practices. So if you are working with an evaluator that you're not feeling these things, that's not right. So don't doubt yourself and don't settle for anything less, because it's going to be a hard way to get useful data and useful evaluation if you don't have these things in place with your consultant. And then the last thing I wanted to share is just some resources. There's a website called Better Evaluation that has a whole wide range of things, including an amazing list of different ideas for kind of those more participatory data collection activities. Results-based accountability has a lot of really practical resources. I also wanted to mention Salesforce is free for nonprofits, at least the first 10 subscriptions. I imagine many of you are familiar with this already, but there are some resources required to set up Salesforce, even if the subscriptions are free. And Adelante Development Center Diverse IT Program trains people in being Salesforce consultants, and also will do the consulting for nonprofits to set up Salesforce. I haven't talked to them in a couple of years, but I went to their website and it looks like they're still doing this work. And I think this is a great resource that many nonprofits might not be aware of. And then there are some links here for if you're trying to have more visual reporting. There's a tool called Google Data Studio that might be a resource. And then there's a great blog from a data visualization guru that tells you all kinds of things that you can do in Excel that you had no idea that was possible to do in Excel. And so she, again, really says, hey, you don't need all these fancy tools to necessarily make your data look good. So that's all I have. Oh, I do have, I lied. I have one last poll. I wonder if you can tell me what you're going to use from today and then what you want more training and resources about. And I care so much about these questions that I'm going to ask you to put it in the poll to make sure I have it rather than popping it in the chat. So let me get to the next. So if you go back to that pollev.com/project echo D101, the same one you used at the beginning. If you can type in what's one thing you'll use from today's presentation. Thank you, Robert. Robert just put the link in the chat again. What's one thing you'll use from today's presentation? logic model in all caps.
Nancy, I'll just lift up. There is a question in the chat from Claire. How important is it to separate the data collection and evaluator roles from the program service provider roles? In a lean organization, this can be tricky.
That is a great question, Claire. And I am on the side of practicality and learning, but there are certainly other evaluators who would have a different perspective. I think you need to do what needs to be done. And often, if not usually, that's going to involve including your program and service providers in the data collection, including some of the examples that I shared. I think a few things that you can do in addition to that are, if you have somebody who is in the role of like managing your data or being the evaluator, even part of their job, they can review the data that was collected by other people, review it collectively together so there's transparency and who's collecting what, reflect together on any anomalies that you notice, things like that. So and you could even have potentially an external evaluator review your protocols and your tools, but maybe you don't have the funding or the time for them to do the data collection. So I think you absolutely have to almost always involve the program folks. There's no way to completely separate them. And I think that's a little bit of an archaic idea now. That kind of goes back to the evaluator being the objective person, which is, we know none of us are truly objective in any way. I'm gonna switch to the last question, is what would you like more training or resources for around evaluation? And this should come up in your poll. And thank you very much for all of the other things. I'm sorry we ran out of time for questions, Robert. I babbled too much. But this has been lovely, and I wish I could have seen you all, I have to say.
Nancy, would you mind, I think would you be open to leaving your contact information? That way, if people have questions, they can email you. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. I would absolutely love to hear from you. I'm going to put my email in right now. And we will take your feedback and your requests very seriously and figure out, if there's additional ways that New Mexico Evaluators can help support evaluation in the nonprofit sector.
Awesome. Thank you. I was going to say there's still people on the call, so I don't know, Nancy, if you have to jump off to another meeting or anything like that. But if yes, if anyone has any questions for Nancy or New Mexico Evaluators, you're welcome to email nhood@salud.unm.edu. Just so you know, we'll make this recording available over YouTube for folks. So you'll see that probably in about a couple days or so, along with I believe the slides. Nancy, is okay if you send me a PDF of your slides? That'd be really
absolutely
helpful. Awesome. Thank you. And I think that's pretty much it, I think. But Nancy, do you have anything anything you'd like to add before we close out for the day?
No, I have a few minutes to stay on if anybody wants to chat. I know everybody's schedules are really tight, so I apologize again for going too long.
Awesome. I can keep the channel open, and if folks have questions or they like to unmute, I just invite anyone to unmute themselves, or if they have any questions or anything like that, or just any comments you would like to share, you're welcome to do so. And I will just keep this line open, but I'll say we'll see you next week on March 16th at 2 p.m. over Zoom. We'll be holding another one of our New Mexico Recover series with Tanya Brown on top 10 grant seeking tips. So stay tuned for some more of that information. You can register on our website when we have that up. Pretty much, hopefully within a day or so, but we'll get that out to you all as soon as possible. And just big thanks to you, Nancy, for joining us today and for this really wonderful and informational PowerPoint.